All right, and welcome to our final video in our series on all those things that make life on Earth possible. We've talked about our location in the galaxy, we've talked about our type of star, we've talked about our distance from that star, we've talked about the composition of our planet, we've talked about our moon stabilizing our wobble. Finally, we're going to talk about our ozone layer, something I'm sure you've probably heard about, but maybe don't know too much about how it protects life here on Earth. So the last component of these 6 things that make life on Earth possible, at least complex life, is our ozone layer. So enjoy, and I will see you shortly. Be sure to take notes and have questions ready.
Now we're on number 6. And number 6, like I said, deals mainly with the ability for the Earth to support complex life, or at least complex life on the surface of Earth. And who's to say that if we only had life in the oceans, we wouldn't have complex social systems with cities and, well, probably not airplanes, but underwater airplanes? I guess that's a submarine. Anyway, there'd still be life, but there wouldn't be New York City. So let's move on to this final lecture. It's another fairly short one. And number 6, we have an ozone layer to block harmful rays. So not only does our magnetic field protect the Earth from harmful solar radiation, we have the additional protection of the ozone layer. So we have these multi-leveled layers of protection. So not only do we have the magnetic field created by the churning core in the Earth's center, but we have an ozone layer. So let me read. Ancient plant-like organisms in the oceans added oxygen to the atmosphere and created a high-altitude layer of ozone that shielded early land species from lethal radiation. So there's a lot in here, and we're actually going to dive much deeper into this later on when we start talking about plants and photosynthesis. So let me explain. Billions of years ago, we had life in the ocean. We have had life on this planet for 3.8 billion years, a very long time. But it took a while for complex life to get started, and ultimately, this needed to happen. We needed an ozone layer to get the ball rolling on complex life, especially that can be found on the surface of the Earth. So what happened is you have these tiny microorganisms, cyanobacteria, blue-green algae. It begins photosynthesizing. And if you remember what that means, that's where an organism, a plant, or in some cases something that's kind of like an animal, in this case a bacteria, will actually take in carbon dioxide into its body using chemical reactions. And I say body, we have to imagine a single-celled organism or something like a plant. But it takes carbon dioxide into its cells, and through photosynthesis, a chemical reaction, light breaks apart not just the carbon dioxide, but water as well. CO2 and H2O combine, they form sugar, or starch, and oxygen. And when this process started up, hundreds of millions of years ago, billions of years ago, it began creating the atmosphere that we have now, and it put oxygen into the atmosphere when there really wasn't much there initially, in the beginning. So that process created an oxygen-rich atmosphere, and when that happened, solar radiation was able to take charge. So here we have a diagram that shows sort of the surface of the Earth where all the human activity is happening. And one thing that's really interesting is that ozone exists down in our cities. You actually see ozone when you see smog, like when you're looking at Albuquerque or pictures of Los Angeles or large cities, you see that sort of brownish haze over the city. That is actually, some of that is actually ozone, O3. So it's harmful. It's a harmful pollutant at the surface, but way up in the lower stratosphere, it forms this protective layer that prevents all of the UVC radiation, so ultraviolet radiation that's really harmful. It lets in very little UVB radiation, which is really harmful as well. These two really are bad for your skin. They are the ones that really, in high amounts, will give you skin cancer very quickly. But it does let in a lot of the UVA, which is why you can still have a sunburn, you can still tan your skin, but you can also still get sun damage and skin cancer if you're not protecting yourself with a hat, a good shirt, or sunscreen. So this is sort of how the structure of the atmosphere works and what the ozone layer does. This is how it forms. So sunlight are these little particles of light called a photon, and they have a lot of energy. As I'm sure you know, when you go outside and get a sunburn, you can see that something as seemingly innocuous, as seemingly harmless as a ray of sunlight, can actually burn your skin and can actually, sometimes, if you're in the sun long enough, it'll blister your skin. It's so harmful. Well, that photon of light will run into one of these oxygen molecules. Now remember, these oxygen molecules were not really in the atmosphere before those early forms of life began creating oxygen through photosynthesis. So when those early organisms began creating that first oxygen, the ozone layer began to form because sunlight would run into an oxygen molecule, it would split it apart. With enough energy, you can split atoms apart. It created two individual oxygen molecules. They quickly bound up with an existing O2 molecule, oxygen in its molecular form, which means it's a compound of more than one atom. Likes to be together. Oxygen likes to be next to each other, which you'll learn later in chemistry and you may remember from middle school. But sometimes, under the right conditions, oxygen will take on an additional atom. It'll form O3. That is ozone. That is what ozone is. It's O3. 3 oxygen atoms forming the ozone molecule. And what happens is that layer reflects back a lot of that harmful UV radiation that we really don't want to be coming into too much contact with. So this process, this layer of our Earth was created by life hundreds of millions, if not billions of years ago, or at least began creating it. Now you may have heard that the ozone layer was in trouble in the 20th century and is still to some extent in trouble today. And we'll actually talk about that later on as well when we talk more about the atmosphere and things like that. But it's a really interesting story, and I will probably provide an extra credit opportunity for anyone who's interested in learning more about it. So, that being said, we have the ozone layer formed by the breakup of an oxygen molecule from a ray of sunlight. It is a layer in the stratosphere, the lower stratosphere of the Earth, which is around where airplanes fly, and it was created by life. It was created by tiny microscopic one-celled organisms hundreds of millions and billions of years ago that created our atmosphere and therefore created the oxygen. And then that oxygen would go on to form ozone. I will have materials linked in the description. I will have occasionally materials that I will provide to you in this video, embedded in this video, and I'll always recommend additional videos. So today there's a video I recommend. I highly recommend that you use it for your research. So with that being said, I bid you adieu, and I will see you next time.